Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something complex. It's the timeline for deporting undocumented immigrants here in the U.S.
Right.
You've probably heard a lot of talk about immigration enforcement, how fast it should be, or how slow it is. We wanted to unpack just how long it can actually take, to deport someone who isn't authorized to be here, and maybe touch on some of the big reasons why.
Yeah, it's definitely not as straightforward as people might think.
We'll be looking at court rulings, some official data, expert analysis, really trying to get a clearer picture of this whole process. Because it might seem like, okay, someone enters without permission, they get caught, they're quickly sent back. Simple.
But that's often not the reality at all.
The reality, as we'll see, can be, dramatically different. Years, sometimes.
That's right. The initial entry, maybe crossing the border without authorization, that can happen relatively quickly, sure.
Yeah.
But the actual legal process, the administrative side, and then the physical deportation itself, that's a whole other ballgame.
A much longer game.
Much longer. We're often talking about timelines that stretch into years for an individual case. And when you scale that up, think about large numbers of people. This system could take decades to handle it all.
Decades. Wow. Okay. And it sounds like a huge part of this delay is, the legal system itself, right? The courts.
Absolutely. That's a major factor.
We saw this get some attention recently, didn't we? With that Supreme Court ruling, April 7th, 2025. It was related to a TRO, a temporary restraining order from Chief Judge James Boasberg.
Yes, that touched on some key concepts.
Things like reasonable notice and habeas corpus hearings. These are like legal safeguards, protections.
Exactly, due process rights.
Okay, so help us understand that part. How do these requirements, these mandates for individual hearings, how do they impact the actual timeline for deportations?
Well, fundamentally, due process is this principle that anyone facing deportation has a right to their day in court, a right to present their case to an immigration judge. And while that commitment to individual hearings is, a cornerstone of our legal system, it naturally adds time. A lot of time, potentially.
Especially when you multiply it by the number of cases.
Precisely. When you look at the sheer volume the system is grappling with, the cumulative effect of ensuring every single one of those mandated hearings happens, it stretches the timeline out significantly.
And that volume, it's enormous, isn't it? I mean, the figures we looked at suggest a backlog of something like 4 million immigration cases already, just waiting.
That's right, around 4 million currently in the system.
And how many judges are handling all that?
Currently, there are about 734 immigration judges nationwide.
734 judges for 4 million cases. That sounds like a lot for each judge.
It is. It's a considerable workload.
Yeah.
And just looking at that existing backlog at the current pace with those judges, estimates suggest it would take around 5.4 years just to clear the current queue.
5.5 years just for the cases already there.
Now, think about adding to that. We have estimates, from Pew Research, FWD.US, suggesting there are somewhere between 11 and maybe 14.5 million undocumented immigrants total in the U.S.
Right.
If you imagine adding that many potential new cases into the system, you can see how that would profoundly impact the court's ability to keep up.
So let's crunch those numbers, just hypothetically. If you add, say, 11 to 14.5 million potential cases onto the existing backlog, with only those 734 judges, what are we talking about time-wise?
Well, doing the math based on current processing rates, adding that many cases could realistically push the total processing time out to somewhere between 15 and 20 years.
15 to 20 years?
Yes, that's the scale we could be looking at with the current infrastructure.
And even if we, say, manage to double the number of judges, which would be a huge undertaking in itself.
Right. Even if you somehow doubled the judges to, say, 1,468, you'd still be looking at a very long time, likely somewhere in the range of 7.5 to maybe 9.9 years just to work through that combined caseload.
So even doubling the judges still means almost a decade, potentially. Those are really significant timelines.
They really are.
Now, it's important here, I think, to acknowledge the different viewpoints. From one perspective, often emphasizing fairness and due process, the argument is that these individual hearings, no matter how long they take, are absolutely essential, right?
That's a crucial point, yes. The argument is that everyone, regardless of their circumstances or how they arrived, deserves a chance to present their case, to explain why they might have a legal basis to stay, especially when facing something as serious as deportation. It aligns with core legal values.
It's about fundamental fairness in the process.
Exactly.
But then, the flip side is the practical reality. These necessary legal steps, these hearings, they undeniably contribute to the massive delays we're talking about. It creates a huge bottleneck, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Especially when dealing with the numbers we've discussed. It slows the whole system down.
And the court hearings. They're really just one part of the whole picture, aren't there? There are other challenges, too.
Oh, definitely. The court backlog is huge, but there are significant logistical challenges involved in actually carrying out deportations, especially on a large scale.
Yeah.
We're talking about moving potentially millions of people.
Right. So beyond the courtroom drama, what other practical hurdles, these bottlenecks, add to the lengthy timelines?
Well, several things kick in. We already talked about the number of judges. That's a primary constraint.
And expensive to fix, you mentioned.
Very expensive. Adding maybe 1,000 more judges could cost upwards of $12 billion a year, based on some estimates. But even after an initial hearing, there are often further legal stops.
Like appeals?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Things like habeas petitions connecting back to that Supreme Court ruling we mentioned, and asylum appeals. These processes alone can add significant extra time to a case.
How much time are we talking?
Potentially anywhere from another 4 to 7 years, just for those appeal stages.
Wow. So years for the initial hearing, then potentially years more for appeals.
That's often how it plays out. And then there's the physical side. Where do you hold people while all this legal process unfolds?
Detention, right.
Detention capacity is another major bottleneck.
Yeah.
Current facilities are often full or close to it. Building new ones or expanding existing ones is costly, maybe $180 million a year, just for new facilities based on projections.
So not enough judges, not enough court time, potentially not enough detention space.
And then there's another layer. Actually getting the person's home country to take them back.
Oh, right. Diplomatic issues.
Diplomatic refusals, yeah.
Yeah.
It happens. Sometimes a country will simply refuse or delay indefinitely, issuing travel documents to accept their own citizens back.
So someone could have a final deportation order after years in the system and still not actually be deported.
It happens more than you might think. We have data suggesting there are about 1.4 million people currently in the U.S. who already have final deportation orders, but they remain here partly because their home countries haven't agreed to their return yet.
1.4 million. That's a huge number of people kind of stuck in limbo after the legal process is technically over. What a practical challenge.
It really is. So you add up the legal requirements, the court backlogs, the appeals, the detention limits, the diplomatic hurdles. It paints a picture of a very, very long process.
Yeah, it becomes clear why there are discussions about how to maybe speed things up given these timelines.
Exactly. Given these significant timeframes created by the current legal setup and these very real logistical limits, it's understandable that people are proposing potential strategies to try and expedite deportations.
So what kinds of strategies are being floated or discussed? How could they potentially shorten these timelines?
Well, several approaches come up in these discussions. One involves more legal action, potentially appeals going up to the Supreme Court again, trying to maybe narrow the scope of due process requirements in certain types of deportation cases.
Trying to limit the grounds for appeal or challenge?
Something like that. That April 7th ruling might offer some clues about the court's direction on these things. Another strategy often mentioned is expanding the use of expedited removal.
What's that exactly?
It's a faster process with fewer legal steps that can currently be applied to certain individuals. For example, people caught very near the border shortly after entry, or individuals with certain criminal convictions, or, say, alleged gang affiliations. The idea is to expand who qualifies for that faster track.
I see. So target specific groups for a quicker process?
That's the idea behind it. Other things discussed include, increasing public or political pressure on the courts and agencies to prioritize and just move cases faster.
Pushing the system harder?
Right. Or exploring new legislation. Maybe laws that could streamline the legal process itself or allocate significantly more resources, judges, officers, facilities.
More money, more staff.
Potentially. There have also been suggestions about auditing or increasing scrutiny on organizations that provide legal aid to immigrants fighting deportation. And then, in some more, let's say, extreme discussions, the idea of using the military in some capacity has even been mentioned, perhaps for logistics or enforcement, although that's generally seen as a very remote possibility with lots of legal hurdles itself.
Gotcha. So a range of possibilities, from legal tweaks to more resources to, more drastic measures.
But it's important to stress, these are strategies discussed as potential responses to the long timelines, We're just outlining what's being proposed or considered in policy circles.
Right, okay. So putting this all together, the big picture seems really clear now. This idea that deporting large numbers of undocumented immigrants could be a quick, straightforward operation, it just doesn't match the reality on the ground.
Not at all.
The legal guarantees, the due process, the massive court backlogs, all those logistical challenges we talked about, judges, detention, diplomacy, they all weave together to create these incredibly long timelines.
Timelines that can easily stretch over many years and potentially even decades when you consider the entire population involved.
Decades. It really highlights the contrast, doesn't it? Between the relative speed someone might enter the country without authorization and the often incredibly slow, complex, resource-intensive process required to legally process and then remove them.
Absolutely. The system, as it's currently set up, with its current laws and resources, simply isn't built for rapid, large-scale removals. It's designed, intentionally or not, for a much slower, individualized process.
And when you look at the sheer numbers involved, those estimated 11 to 14.5 million people and the system's current capacity, these extended timelines almost feel inevitable under the current rules.
It certainly seems that way, which raises some really difficult questions.
Yeah, it definitely prompts you to think about the fairness and the practicality of different ways to handle immigration enforcement, knowing these realities.
Absolutely. This deep dive, I think, really underscores the enormous commitment of time, of money, of personnel that any serious attempt at large-scale deportation would require under the current framework.
It really does.
And that leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it? Given these immense challenges, the time involved, the costs, what are the most effective and the most just ways for our society to manage immigration policy and address the reality of millions of undocumented people already here?
That's the big question, isn't it? No easy answers there.
Definitely not. But understanding these timelines, these bottlenecks, these complexities, it's crucial if we're going to have an informed conversation about where we go from here.